So last week, Pastor David began our sermon series discussing this challenging question we face in our lives. The question, why do people suffer? Why do people suffer? It's a question I know that we wonder about, especially when we're in the midst of tragic circumstances. We want to know, we want answers, want to try to understand what really is not understandable. It's really an important thing for us to think about as Christians for a few reasons, but for one, we may not know what to do and how to handle it when someone in our lives is suffering. And I think sometimes we hear all kinds of these common things that people tend to say when bad things happen. And I think that we as Christians can do better on that. And so I want to give you my list. I'm going to give you my little list of the top 3 things people sometimes say in times of suffering that I believe are pretty, unhelpful. That I wish people wouldn't say. Okay, number 3 on Pastor Brian's wish list of things I wish people wouldn't say. Number 3, God won't give you more than you can handle. You have heard this. I know you have. I don't think it is very helpful for us. And I also don't think that it's correct. First of all, sometimes we have in our lives, especially in the midst of suffering, people sometimes have more than we should have to handle. We shouldn't diminish that struggling as if to say people should just be handling it better or people should just be stronger. Second of all, I don't think that we should just automatically assume that God is just going around handing out hard or tragic things for us to handle. Bad things happen, they just do. And really, I think it makes God sad too. Okay, number 2 on my list of things I wish people wouldn't say. If this was a decade ago and David Letterman's top 10, we'd have a drum roll or something, which isn't weird at all on this. Okay, this one is really hard because I know people are always well-meaning and never intentionally adding to the trauma of things, but I would avoid this. It's the phrase, God must have needed another angel. And just like the last one, it's like we're blaming God for our suffering. And I just do not think that is how God works. But mostly, if someone has lost someone that they love, if I lose someone that I love, please do not say this to me. Just give me a hug. Say, I'm so sorry. Just be present when people are hurting. Sometimes we really don't need to say much of anything at all for them to know that we care. Okay, the number 1 thing that I wish people wouldn't say, and I know it's a favorite, so don't be mad at me, but it's everything happens for a reason. I know you've heard it. I just don't agree. It is true that there are times when, looking back, we can dig some good out of a tragic circumstances. I think that we are called to look for good in all things, and God absolutely can work good from all things, as the scriptures say. But I don't think that means that God is going around making awful things happen so that we can learn a life lesson. And I think that's part of the question that is asked when we wonder why do people suffer? We want to know the reason because we've been told that there's a reason. And though I think this is a really important discussion for us as Christians, I'm not sure that we are asking the right question, why do people suffer? I'm not even sure that should be a question. People suffer, period. bad things happen. It's just the reality of the world that we live in. But I do think that there may be even better questions that we're really actually trying to tackle in this sermon series that David began last week. Something like, given the reality that people suffer, that we may suffer too at some point, how can we really live, really thrive? How can we ready ourselves for the reality of suffering? And questions like where is God? Where is God in the midst of suffering? And these are questions that I think that we can get a little closer to answering. We're reading this great story this week from the Old Testament about the prophet Elijah that speaks, I think, to these burning questions that we may have. And we're reading from 1 Kings from chapter 19. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. And then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also if I do not make your life like one of them by this time tomorrow." And then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I'm no better than my ancestors." And then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him, and said, "Get up and eat, or the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of the Lord that 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he answered, I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. In our scripture, we read of Elijah, one of the great prophets of God. In fact, Elijah was such a great and significant prophet that the scriptures tell us that in the end, he doesn't even die as the rest of us do. He is taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire. Elijah is one of the greats. And we see, though, in our scripture today that Elijah, he is at the end of his rope. It was just before this story that Elijah stood strong against 450 prophets of Baal in a great show of power, calling down fire from God. He defeated these prophets, showing who the real God is, where true power comes from. But now Elijah, facing a threat on his life from his enemy, he runs away into the wilderness. He's too weary, too worried to go on anymore. He says, "It is enough now, Lord. Take away my life." And so he collapses under a little tree and he goes to sleep. And haven't you ever had so much on your list, so anxious about everything that you just gotta take a nap? I don't know what it is about that, but I get it. I don't know what that's about, but I get it, Elijah. So here's Elijah in the wilderness. He's in the wilderness. And when we hear things like this about geography in the Bible, it's not an accident. Geography is theology in the Bible, I've heard it said. So when we hear about someone in the wilderness, it means something. The wilderness is the end of the line. It's the end of the line, but it's also where God often shows up, like we see with Moses and the burning bush, or the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. Elijah, he is done. He's scared and he's hungry. He doesn't want to go on, and maybe you've been there too. He's run away to the wilderness. He falls asleep under a broom tree, but God doesn't leave him alone. An angel comes as a messenger, a reminder of God's presence, and says to him, get up and eat. The angel says, get up and eat. The angel says it again, for the journey is too much for you. He's got more than he can handle. But the angel comes along, bakes him a cake. He eats and he takes another nap, has some cake baked by an angel, which I imagine is just some really good home cooking cake, angel-made cake. Angel food cake. Maybe that's where that comes from. Anyway. And then he's able to get up. And then he's able to walk on a little further on his journey. And I love that this is like a gentle reminder for us. I've heard it said that we should never underestimate the spiritual power of a nap and a snack. And that works for me sometimes. It tells us something. The angel comes along and never minimizes, never dismisses the difficulties of Elijah's journey. She never says, get over yourself, Elijah. God won't give you more than you can handle. No. Instead, she says, the journey is too much for you. You won't make it on your own. And we don't have to. God comes alongside us in our struggling and gives us what we need to go on. So Elijah, he gets up, he runs away a little further on his journey. He runs away and he hides in a cave. We remember in the story, there's a great wind. There's an earthquake, there's a fire, all these loud and mighty spectacles that we might expect or assume God would use to finally get our attention. We might in our lives be looking for that kind of sign. But God was not in the wind or the earthquake. God was not in the fire. Rather, in the suffering of Elijah, God comes as a still, small voice. Or in our translation today, in the sound of sheer silence. Elijah is there in that cave on the Mount Horeb. And if geography is theology, if you think of what happens on the mountains in the scriptures, nothing insignificant ever happens on a mountain. It's just that the significant thing that happens in this story is the sound of sheer silence. But we shouldn't be mistaken thinking that any experience of God, any knowing of the presence of God, even in silence, is insignificant. It is not. The writer and speaker John Ortberg wrote a book called God is Closer Than We Think. In the book, he says that the central promise in the Bible is not, I will forgive you, although that promise is there. It is not the promise of life after death, although we are offered that as well. The most frequent promise in the Bible is I will be with you. And this is true for us as well. God is with us. God's loving presence, God's voice whispering peace and comfort, whatever season we're in. Elijah's running and hiding. He's lost sight of God's presence with him. And so God asks him, what are you doing here, Elijah? In his hiding, God asks, what are you doing here? Where are you? As if an all-knowing God doesn't already know the answer. It's the same question that God asks Adam and Eve in the garden when they run and hide. Where are you? Where are you, God says. Where are you in relation to me, God means. Where are you? Someone once said, if you don't feel close to God, guess who moved? Where are you, God says to us. The love and the presence of God is waiting, ready, reaching out for us. I was at a conference recently where a woman spoke about how she had been really struggling, going through a rough season in her life, and she admitted to us, that she hardly ever anymore had been feeling like doing the whole church thing. She wasn't feeling like doing the prayer thing or the faith thing really at all anymore. But she insisted also. She insisted that it was really the only thing that was getting her through, her doing it anyway. She said we have to continue the practice of faith even when the moods of faith fail us. It may feel like going through the motions, but sometimes the motions are all that we have. And hope in times of suffering, it is not accidental, and neither is faith. We practice faith. We practice faith even when we don't feel like it. And the truth is that active stance of faith, in that active stance of faith, something begins to happen. And God meets us there, strengthens us, reminds us that we are not alone. And God then gives us what we need to continue on our journey. There's a story of a young priest who was having trouble with his daily devotions, and he told of a visiting friend that he told him that he would forget what he had read in the Bible almost as soon as he would close the book. And the old man told him to continue with his spiritual discipline of daily Bible reading, but to take on another task as well. The young man had 2 buckets in his simple hut, and one bucket he was to leave there and leave it alone. And the other bucket he was to go and fill with water each day and empty it out. And the old man promised to return in just a few weeks, and so the young man did as he was asked. And sometime later, the old man came back for a visit and asked about the buckets. And the young man pointed and said that one was the one bucket that was left alone. It was all dusty, cobwebs all over it. But the other bucket that he had filled with water and emptied it out, it was clean from daily filling with water. Even if we don't feel like it, even if we feel like we're just going through the motions, something happens within us. God is working within us, building us from the inside out. There was a grandma and a grandpa driving across Kansas on vacation with their little granddaughter. They were enjoying the sights and especially the fields of corn that they were passing by. And the wind was blowing hard, and Grandma commented, saying it looks like the wind could just blow the corn right over. And their 5-year-old granddaughter piped up, said, "Oh no, Grandma," she said, "it's planted deep. That corn's planted deep, and you don't blow down when you're planted deep." There's only one way to build a good life, to have a thriving, abundant kind of life, even in the hard things, even in the midst of suffering. Jesus tells us in Matthew, he says, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been built on the rock. When we set our life on Jesus, stay ever near his side, when we plant ourselves deep in God's love, then when the rains come, when the winds blow, as they are prone to do in this life, we are on a firm foundation with a faith ready for the wilderness. And surely for us as ever, God will meet us there. Amen.